All right. I'm here with Forrest Gander. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad to be here. I like your program, I like your blog.
I appreciate it. One of the things I wanted to ask you, just like right off the bat, is there's probably a lot of people listening to this, or just a lot of people in general, who want badly to connect with poetry, and they hear, maybe they read critics who, describe their experiences with it. It's like, well, it seems like these people are having a profound connection. Like, why can't I have that? And the reason I ask this is, how did you, maybe it's better to just get your sense of it. How did you fall in love with poetry?
Well, one, I wish there were more critics writing about it that people could. Um, and two, I think well, for me, my mother was a elementary school teacher, and her father was a Swede, and so this is going back to the early 20th century. That he raised her. He would stomp around the house reciting 19th century poems. And it seemed like that whole generation of people had poems memorized,
Mm.
and so he would, you know, "You call me chief, and you do well to call him chief, who for 12 long years fought and faced every form of man or beast the Roman Empire could provide." So my mom liked poetry, and when I was a child, she who raised me and my two sisters alone, um, would read me. She liked Carl Sandburg and Edgar Allan Poe, and oh, those rhythms got into my body and into my head, and
Yeah.
um, I was a goner.
There you go. But you say you were a goner, but at what point then did you decide? Like, I know you studied like geology as well as English in college. I mean, I don't know if you were planning on being a geologist at any point, but when did you have a moment when you said, okay, I'm gonna be a poet? Like, it's a big plunge.
Yeah, I mean, there was sort of a two-stage moment. I thought I was a hotshot poet in high school, and when I was in my first year in college, I showed a professor my poetry at William and Mary, and he looked up at me with these sort of um, weepy eyes and said, "Forrest, these are terrible." And that was a critical moment for me, because then I thought, oh, I need to really learn something about the art. It's not just my self-expression. And then when I graduated, and then at my company there were people who were also interested in poetry as well as geology. Since I didn't have a father, I felt like I needed to be responsible and have a job. So I thought poetry is not going to make it. I love geology. I love the earth. I'll major in geology. I'll major in both, which is what I did. But then the year after I got out of college, I came down with third stage melanoma. I
Wow.
came very close to dying, and had this time to sort of think in the hospital, what if my life isn't going to be very long? What do I most want to do? And and it was clear to me what I most wanted to do, what I was most passionate about, was literature, was writing. So as soon as I was healthy enough, I applied to graduate schools, and um, and I studied poetry. I got a degree in creative writing.
Wow, I had a friend of mine who passed away recently who struggled with a disease for years, and because of that decided, okay, I'm just gonna pursue acting in LA, which is
Yeah.
very, I mean, it's a total crapshoot, but it, in a weird way, were you kind of, I don't know if I would say like thankful for that experience, but it sounds like it had a positive impact in your life.
It did. It made me suddenly much more serious about my life than I had been as a 21-year-old.
Yeah.
And um, and it takes a deep seriousness to choose to be an actor or to choose to be a writer in a country where it's very difficult to make it in either of those fields. So, like Cormac McCarthy says, your heart has to be so big that um, it can take you through all your wrong turnings and errors.
And do you feel like if you had done some other job, like you could have eked out poetry on the side and been satisfied and fulfilled as a writer, or you had to go all in?
I wouldn't. It depends upon whether I was giving advice to someone else,
Sure.
in
Yeah.
which case I would say you can do anything and do this um, if your intention is great enough. Um, but and maybe I would have. Maybe it would have turned out that got a job as a geologist and wrote poetry on the side. But I think the reason that whatever success that I've had in this field had to do with going whole hog,
Yeah.
with going in, taking the risk, feeling like I could wait tables for years, because it gave me time to do writing, and that was okay. I didn't have ambition to be wealthy, or I just wanted to make enough that I could pursue what I was most passionate about.
And that the graduate school path seems to be, um, at least in the States, I don't know what it's like elsewhere. It seems to be like the path, especially for a lot of literary minded writers. Um, do you feel like that's a good thing that anyone who is really serious about being a poet goes straight to MFA, or uh, do you think that has an effect on the climate of writing in the country?
Yeah, of course, it does. When I went to get a degree, there weren't very many MFAs. In fact, mine was an MA degree at San Francisco.
Mm.
And but since then, the number of MFA programs has increased logarithmically, and lots of people go through them, and not all of those writers are going to have a career in writing, and a lot of them are just looking for jobs teaching. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that um, it can you can be very lucky to be given well, especially if you're not paying a lot of money to get a degree that doesn't guarantee you a job or a future. Um, and most good graduate programs will pay you to be there, and that's a really rich moment. To no matter what happens with the rest of your life, if you have 2 or 3 years where you can focus on something that you really love and really try it out, and be around people who are eating and drinking and thinking, in the same field as you, feeding you, everything's feeding that tree. That's a really lucky moment, no matter what you do from there. But yeah, the expectation that you'll get a good job after you do that is an expectation that isn't fulfilled for a lot of people. I think that's okay too. Why not have why not have a couple years where you try something, that you take a risk, and if that doesn't work out, you do something else instead of getting on some career ladder, right away and just climbing up.
Yeah, and part of the reason why I asked is because you obviously have famously, someone like Shakespeare, who was not one of the university men, unlike his fellow contemporary playwrights. Do you feel on some level that maybe like the MFA culture uh, breeds like an over intellectualized poetry, where it's not hitting as much with ordinary people?
Well, that's interesting. I think that changed way before the MFA programs. It changed with modernism, with Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot in particular, whose work really appalled a more populist poet like William Carlos Williams, that was happening there, but also that um, like people's expectation of what they wanted from literature began to change in the 1900s, the 20th century. um, the uh, uh, in the 19th century, um, poetry often ended with sort of wisdom statements, you know, little nodes of wisdom, and people came to distrust that, as people came to distrust a unitary speaking voice acting as though it was speaking for everyone. And so poetry became more complicated, more inclusive, and it became more um, innovative in its strategies because um, because I think people needed that old form of familiarity was losing its power as an art because it was simply banking on cliches.
Hmm. And
That's why, uh,
please, no, 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 please.
well, also why, I mean, the 19th century poetry was often rhymed. Rhymed poetry is really easy to remember. And so it was more digestible by a lot of people. I think poetry is still uh, something that, I mean, I've memorized um, hours and hours of poems. When my wife was delivering a baby, all I did was recite poetry. But it takes maybe more investment, or it takes a, a finer tuning of the ear to memorize based on changing rhythms than a very predictable rhythm with a rhyme that is like a typewriter ching at the end
Yeah,
each
that's
line.
you were reciting poems while your wife was giving birth. I love that. I wonder how
Well,
often that's happened.
only thing I could do to try to make her feel more comfortable.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's what's interesting about some of your poems is that, and I've read some of what people have written about them, and sometimes people describe them as being experimental. And I've heard you in some interviews say that you feel like that's kind of an incomplete word, or maybe misleading. And the reason I go on this task, or on this tack rather, is do you feel like there's progress being made in art? Is poetry like science where there's clearly like, okay, the modernists have discovered a better way to write a poem, or what's going on there?
Yeah, that's a great question. In some ways, like, has art ever been surpassed? Has art ever surpassed the paintings on the cave walls,
Right.
or first horses that were carved? I don't know that I could, say for sure that they have, but I do know. I think that um, art does have to keep changing. You can't write the same poem that Keats wrote now and expect that it's going to have the same effect. Um, that art has to keep renewing itself by making itself uh, change, and that people's ears change and people's sight changes. That Chaucer, he's writing at a time when most of the poets in English are writing in Middle English are writing in um, uh, tetrameter rhythms, and he's listening to the French Alexandrines, and he starts writing in iambic pentameter, and people's ears change. And now, still, sort of the basic unit of English is the pentameter line. That you know, we even talk that way.
No.
We parse our sentences into sort of 5 beat um, phrases.
And on for your poems, do you feel like when you're doing something that may be more what is considered experimental, are you trying deliberately to create something new, or is this just something that comes about organically?
Well, it's Probably both sensibility and my sense that art does need to have an edge, that it needs to be going somewhere, that it can't just be repeating what people have already done. Um, that major art lets you see in ways that you haven't seen before. So in my work, I am trying to explore ways of making that happen that aren't just syntactical. They have to do with rhythm and form and sound and language texture. But I do want to, I do, I am involved in perception and how people perceive world and language. And I do think that art and poetry can help shape that.
I see. And speaking of shaping the world, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is politics in poetry. 'Cause it feels, I don't know how you feel about this, but it feels like there's, and I don't want to name any names or anything like that, but it feels like there's a lot of poetry in the air that is vaguely political, but it feels like it has answers that it wants to give you. And a lot of my favorite poems are like questions. How do you but you seem to have politics in your poetry here and there. I mean, it's there. Like how do you get away with doing that without being uh, you know, the guy who knows?
Well, I'm not the guy who knows, Duncan, but also I'm really, I have read a lot of poetry, and because I translate a lot of Latin American poetry, where politics are often, I mean, especially in the 20th century, Latin American poetry was often very political, and so was Russian poetry in the 20th century, and a lot of that poetry is just awful. Neruda's Pan to Stalin is just awful. Pablo de Roca's, use of political cliches really weakens his poetry, though he's a great poet, and so was Neruda. Mayakovsky, the same thing. I think it's the difference between writing an essay where you do have answers and you're making rational arguments towards an end, and writing a poem is that is that the poet thinks that the questions are more interesting. Um,
I see, yeah. And on that note, when you mentioned the translating, how many languages do you know, by the way?
I just English really, but I have Spanish. I'm not quite as fluent in Spanish as I would like to be. I
Mhm.
get in over my head in some discussions, but I'm basically pretty fluent in Spanish. And then I studied Japanese, but I can sound pretty good in it for a little bit. But if you start answering in ways that I'm not expecting, I'm lost.
I see. But
So my translations from Japanese have always been with co-translators.
okay. It Do you feel like there's certain things in Spanish or in Japanese that you can say or express that just does not come across in English?
Yeah, of course, of course.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, in in Spanish, there are sound qualities that are really hard to duplicate in English, and that have been really influential on my own language. Translating a poet, for instance, like Corral Bracho, um, whose whose slippery syntax and very lubricious language is is very hard to write in English without sounding um, like overly heady, or because it's a Latinate language, you uh, because it's more Latinate than English is. If you try to write that way in English, you sound over intellectual, over conceptual.
Mm,
English needs that Anglo-Saxon in it, and of course in Japanese, their whole different sensibility of um, that is also sort of less rational. Um, that even a word like kokoro, which is is like heart and mind together, It's so different from
Mhm.
Western thought. And an old word for poetry in Japanese is kokoro no hara, which is like heart, mind, flowers. Uh,
That's a wonderful image. Yeah. Um, do you, so you work with co-translators on some of those, um, but it's got to be very useful to have a poet in the room. How much do you feel when you're translating this that you're producing a new poem?
um, well, that's the big question about translation, but you are producing a new poem, and anyone who translates my work, the book that comes from that, they've written every single word of it. I didn't write a word in Spanish or Chinese. Um, so the act for me of translation is an act of sublimation. It's an act of getting out of your own head, reading someone's work so deeply that you hear the music of another mind that is not your own. And then you're trying to make that happen in your own language with every trick that you know. But first, it has to do with disappearance
Disappearance, getting out of the way of,
of yourself, getting all of so that what you translate doesn't sound like you, which is a problem with some translators, that they don't get out of the way of the work that they're translating enough.
I see. That's,
But there's a spiritual removal of the
yeah.
self, of the ego, so that you can accommodate this difference.
And that spiritual removal or sort of like the loss of ego, do you feel like that when you're writing your own poems, like you're more channeling something as opposed to consciously directing the experiment?
Also, yes, I do, Duncan. It's that magic moment that you wish happened more often. And I think it happens with lots of people in different, in sports, even in, when you're completely focused on whatever kind of work that you're doing, that moment when you disappear and suddenly 2 hours have gone by. Um, those are those are moments of great privilege, I think, that the artist looks for.
Absolutely. Do you, and that's one of the things I heard like Robert Frost describe writing a poem as like it starts as a lump in the throat and then become, you got to get it out. For someone who is a professional poet, do you have like a routine where you sit down every day and say, okay, at this hour, I am going to write poems, or at least I'm going to put myself in front of a piece of paper, whatever, or does it just come?
It's a funny term that you use, professional poet. There are so few poets who actually live on that profession.
Yes.
Uh, but what I know what you mean is that someone who's sort of dedicated my life to this art form. Um, and now I've forgotten your question, though.
That's fine. No, I was just saying, do you have a routine in order to sort of like summon up that creative experience?
I'm not allowed to talk about that routine.
Okay.
Yeah, it's sort of embarrassing because it's been so changeable. At one period in my life when I had a young child, I was getting up. I'm pretty disciplined, and so I would get up every day at 5 and write until 7, and those 2 hours were where got my work done, and that happened for years. And um, and but then you go through different modes. Now I don't write every day. I don't even write every week. I write recommendation letters every week,
Oh
but I
wow.
don't write poetry every week. I do a fantastic amount of reading, as you do too, Duncan. I'm sort of amazed at what you absorb and respond to. Um, but the writing is a little more haphazard. But maybe at the same time, I feel like at this point, I'm always writing, that I'm always sort of but a lot more of it takes place in my head, instead of coming to the desk an hour every day.
How much do you compose in your head then? Do you have full poems that you just are waiting to get out?
No, I don't. But I accumulate notes all the time. So walking, shopping, even driving, things occur to me. I make a note. I come back to those notes. Those begin to generate material for me.
That's interesting. I remember hearing something about Beethoven just going on a walk through the park and hearing like the twittering of some birds and writing down like something like the the first sort of like motif of Ode to Joy, and you
Yeah,
know,
that's great. I love the stories of Wordsworth and Coleridge, that both of them had to compose sort of in their heads while they were moving. But Wordsworth would be inside his house, walking back and forth across his living room. And Coleridge would be plunging through these hills, which I finally got to see in the Lake District, brushing aside limbs and walking up, rocky patches, and so they composed completely differently, which
yeah.
is why Coleridge is the better poet.
Well, you do a lot of traveling as well, and that shows up in your poetry. Like, what is that? Is that something that you deliberately seek out as like a creative juice, or is that just, sort of parallel to your life as a poet?
Well, that thing I said before about poetry or art having a lot to do with perception, I think it's really good for human beings to get out of the sort of ruts that we all make for ourselves in our lives, our perceptual ruts, and that becoming a stranger in a foreign place, you become the foreigner. And that's a kind of vulnerability, that if you're open to, um, opens opens a lot of different ways of seeing and hearing relationships, um, and I feel like it's that vulnerability that I'm looking for, um,
Mhm.
to get out of my confidence, to get out of my habits, and to be sort of naked in the world.
Yeah, and speaking of being naked in the world, you the poetry collection that won the Pulitzer was Be With, and it had dealt with a lot of your personal grief and laying all that bare. Was that a weird experience, like putting that out there and then winning this fabulous prize for it and having people praise it? I mean, I know you stopped giving like public readings at some point of it. I don't know if you've changed that, but
No, that
was that uncomfortable on any level?
yeah, it was totally weird. It's odd that fewer people have said that, but yeah, it was completely weird to publish a, a book about this pain and this person, that this remarkable person, C.D. Wright, um, who would have been the happiest person for me, and who, in some ways, all of my poetry was written for. And she was the one person that I couldn't share it with. And then for the book to be like, yeah, what did it, how weird is that when people said, congratulations,
Right.
congratulations on, on this awful grief that you live with.
And that's, of course, someone like Emily Dickinson published some poems in her lifetime, but a lot of it was just like kept in her drawer and people found it afterwards. It, do, do you ever feel like there are some poems that you want to write and then just feel like, okay, this is just mine and no one else gets to see this?
Yeah, yeah, I do. I think there can be, for everyone, sort of these things that are so intimate that you don't want to share. I mean, Emily actually did want to share,
Right.
but her times weren't ready for her. She was so far ahead of the popular writers of her time and editors that, but I think she would have been really delighted to have her work published.
Yeah. You'd hope so, because you hear about someone like Kafka who asked, his editor, I forget, his friend, to burn all of his work, and then it gets published. You wonder if he came back to life, he'd be like, guys, no, like what's going on?
I know. I'm really glad the editor, yeah, didn't burn it though.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
was
yeah.
writing, and you wonder, whether how much he meant it.
Hmm.
But and there are examples of of work that simply has disappeared that way.
Right.
We can never judge it.
Yeah, you wonder how many geniuses out there just somebody obeyed their wishes and got rid of all their work.
Yeah, yeah.
One of the things I wanted to ask you is because you've also you write in so many different mediums and genres: poetry, essays, translation, and novel. Uh, how did you approach the writing of a novel from a different perspective that you write poetry? And what I mean by that is, like, did you, like a lot of novel writers I've heard of, just sit down every day and it's very systematic. And poetry seems like it might be a little different. What was that process like?
Um, it's true that with a novel where you have to keep in a where it can be important to keep in the same voice and the same tone, and where you're dealing with characters, not just for a day or a week or a month, but for a year, several years, that if you take a hiatus in your attention to that work, you can lose that. And there are novels that I've read where you can tell, this is where there was a pause, and the work feels a little Frankensteinish. um, so I think the attention is different, and also the intention is different. That with a novel, um, you really need characters that a reader is interested in enough to to follow through the reading. And poetry doesn't need characters so much. It's really the character is the character of the language itself.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a fascinating idea that the poem itself is almost a character.
Hmm.
Um, One of the things that I've asked any creative writers who've come on the show, and I wanted to ask you, are you surprised that uh, technology, and particularly the internet, has not changed how people write as much? In other words, something like the printing press allowed a new form like the novel to take place, because, how could you write a 600-page book before people could just print them out regularly? And now everybody has a printing press in their pocket, and you'd think there'd be new forms and um, new possibilities being explored. Maybe I'm just not familiar with it. Or is that something that you've thought about or pursued on any level?
Yeah, I think about it a lot. And at Brown University, where I used to teach, there was a big interest in digital writing, is one of the ways it was referred to. Um, and um, and then now there's a Japanese poet who's become rather famous because during the disaster at Fukushima, when everyone was evacuated, his parents refused to leave, so he went to be with them in this contaminated town, and from which no one was getting the news, and he sent out tweets that turned into poetry tweets.
Mm,
And he basically wrote a book of poems using Twitter. Um, and I think that all of the sort of registry of new new signs, like emojis and
Yeah.
things are being funneled into the possibilities for poetry. But that thing you said before, um, about like what does innovation mean? I think people often look for the most familiar thing to feel comfortable with. That's why we have, you know, velvet paintings with dogs shooting pool, or 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 ordinary landscapes on our wall. That we often look for things that that give us the feeling of familiarity and safeness. But I think that and so people look for novels that and me too. I love detective fiction.
Yeah.
I look for that, for for a certain satisfaction. Um, and then there are other satisfactions that that art can make when it's a little more exploratory. And I think people are using these different modes of writing, that writers will always take everything available to them and funnel it in to feed the tree.
And do you worry on any level that like the shortening of people's attention spans can uh, make it literary art less like it seems like something like War and Peace just would not be written today, or if it was, it would not get the play that it got at the time.
Yeah, and I mean, that's also a lot about how our culture presents things. Where so, Hart Crane says, "God damn that nostalgia for something always new." Um, um, and Pound is saying, make it new. And Jack Gilbert says, but he forgot to use the word significantly new.
Hmm.
Um, the press often gives a lot of attention to things that are just new, but something that's significantly new is different. Yeah, I worry about the way that language has been compressed to Twitter statements, to Facebook emojis, to that even when we type on our computers, if we can't make errors that can often lead to discoveries or lead to
Mhm.
interesting things, because it's corrected, and our grammar is corrected according to conventions that aren't exploratory at all. So I think that that is a danger, and I think that that writers will work against it. And the great thing is, Duncan, that like the Academy of American Poets has been touting this big survey. It was done like about 4 years ago about poetry in America, and it turns out that now um, a huge number of people, like logarithmically more readers, are reading poetry than ever before in the United States.
Wow.
And the biggest increase in readership is among the young and people of color.
Wow.
And I think that living as we do in an age of spectacle, where we're constantly bombarded by incoming, by ping pings, by visual, really fast cuts, that there's something in our souls that's not being satisfied, and in the souls of the young as well. And they're discovering poetry, which is this miracle, this thing that can happen to you, all by yourself in a room alone, where just your throat is moving as you're reading words on a page. Like, how miraculous is that? That you can
Yeah,
be transported in that kind of an experience.
I didn't know of that survey, but that's fantastic because I mean the our our culture seems to be so dominated by images, and it's very easy to sort of mislead people, I think, with images. That's why advertisements are all, they're not a block of text describing the wonders of the product. Like
Yeah,
that's I mean that's good news. So are you hopeful then, I suppose, for the future of poetry?
I think it's a super rich time for poetry right now, and not just in the United States, but in Europe and in China and Japan right now too. There's a lot of really, and Latin America. it's an explosive time for poetry. I'm seeing stuff that I find really fabulous and rich.
And what about yourself? Do you have any projects forthcoming that you want to talk about?
Sure. Yeah, so I just finished two books of translation, one of this great Mexican poet named Coral Bracho, and um, and then a co-translation with a co-translator named Tomoyuki Endo of a Japanese poet named Shuri Kido. That'll come out from Copper Canyon. He's a very deeply Japanese poet, and his work uh, his work has a lot to do with sort of philosophy and Japanese culture. So it'll be, and I was worried about the reception of this book, but I've been sending out poems, and they've been just everything has been picked up. People are responding really favorably to it, so I feel good about that. And the Coral Bracho is internationally a star. She's already very widely appreciated, and her work is really interesting in the way it breaks down um, the the difference between sort of subjectivity and world. She keeps integrating those things. She walks into a room, and then you feel the room thinking,
Mm.
not just her. So those two things, and then I've been working on a collaboration. I do a lot of collaborations. I really admire the way that collaboration models the kind of social relations that I'm interested in. Um, and I've done a collaboration with a photographer named Jack Shear, um, and his photographs of uh, I don't know if I want to talk about it
No,
yet,
that's
but
fine. That's fine. Okay, cool. Well, look, I've already taken up enough of your time. Is there a way for people to find you? You have like a website or a certain.
I have a yeah, easy to find on the web. Yeah,
Okay,
super. Uh-huh.
perfect. All right, listen, Forrest, I love talking to writers, so this was a treat, and thanks for your time.
Thank you a lot, Duncan.
All
All
right,
right,
take care.
bye.